Have you ever sat in a seat you paid for with your own money and still felt like you were intruding into a space that wasn't meant for you? Not because you did anything wrong, not because you were loud or impolite, but simply because you didn't look like the others in that room. That was the feeling Dr. Anaya Blake, a successful entrepreneur and aviation investor, carried with her when she stepped into first class that morning. It was supposed to be a regular day, just a business flight. Nothing special, until it became a news story no one could believe was real. A female flight attendant slapped her, right there in first class, not because she was causing trouble, not because she did anything wrong, but because she didn't look like someone who could afford a seat there. But what silenced every passenger wasn't the slap. It was the woman's true identity. She wasn't just a passenger, she was the owner of the very plane they were sitting in. In today's video, you'll walk with me through every breathtaking moment of that fateful flight. We'll look deeper into behaviors that seem harmless, but stem from systemic bias. We'll talk about the things they don't teach in textbooks, how silence itself can be a powerful form of resistance. And most importantly, you'll come to see why sometimes the only thing you need to do to overturn an entire system is to sit exactly where you belong and not apologize for it. Stay with us until the very end, because this story isn't just about a slap. It's a reminder that honor doesn't lie in your seat, but in the way you walk into a room with your head held high. So now, let's start from the beginning. From the moment Anaya stepped onto that plane, not knowing she was about to shift an entire industry. Anaya didn't board with pride. She wasn't wearing designer brands, no expensive watch on her wrist. Just a cream-colored turtleneck sweater, tailored slacks, and a small navy handbag she bought from a local artisan shop. Her hair was tied up in a neat bun. Her face had minimal makeup, but her eyes were sharp, observant, and somewhat cautious. Anaya wasn't the type who sought attention, but somehow her calm presence, in a space she wasn't expected to belong to, made others uncomfortable. When she handed over her boarding pass, the female flight attendant gave it a quick glance, then slowly looked her up and down. First class, the attendant raised an eyebrow. Yes, Anaya replied gently. Seat 2A, no welcome, no kind glance, just a curt nod and a step aside, as if she had entered through the wrong door. First class wasn't crowded that day, only 4 passengers. But as Anaya placed her bag on the seat, she could clearly feel the eyes of the middle-aged man in 2B glancing at her, as if trying to assess whether she was a flight attendant. An older woman reading a newspaper paused and glanced up as well. No one said anything. But silence can carry the sound of judgment. That moment, the way a room can turn cold simply because you entered, wasn't new to Anaya. She once said in an interview, sometimes being in the right place with the wrong skin color is enough for someone to think you've disrupted the order. And sadly, it doesn't only happen on planes. In banking, Black clients have been denied the ability to open accounts until they presented themselves as directors. In luxury hotels, guests are asked, "Are you here to deliver food?" even when they've booked the suite. It's not the fault of any one individual. It's the result of a culture that silently etches the image of success, by color, by style, by gender. And anyone who doesn't fit that mold is subject to a kind of rechecking, not by scanners, but by stares. The small lesson from that moment didn't lie in anger. It was in awareness. Anaya didn't react. She didn't raise an eyebrow. She didn't speak. She just gently adjusted her coat and sat down in her seat, firmly, as if she knew exactly she had nothing to prove. Because sometimes power doesn't lie in shouting that you belong. It lies in simply sitting down, opening your laptop, and continuing your work, as if you've always belonged there. And that was just the boarding. We haven't yet talked about what happened next, when not just the eyes, but the flight attendant's hands started to speak. When Anaya sat in seat 2A, she pulled a slim book from her bag. It was her routine, reading a few light pages before takeoff as a way to calm her mind amid the rush of work. But just a few minutes later, before she could even reach page 5, the flight attendant, the middle-aged woman in a crisp uniform with a face that seemed to be enduring the whole cabin, returned. "Excuse me, ma'am? I need to check your ticket again." Anaya was slightly surprised, but she smiled and handed over the ticket. the same e-ticket that had been scanned when she boarded and already checked once at the first-class gate. The attendant examined it more closely this time. She bent down, then looked back up, eyes full of suspicion. You, booked first class. Was this a company-paid ticket? No, Anaya replied calmly. I purchased this ticket using my personal account, directly from the airline. There was no apology, just a dry nod and the words, all right, spoken in a tone completely void of courtesy. This is what people call microaggressions. Those seemingly minor actions that repeat over and over, leaving emotional bruises invisible to anyone but the person experiencing them. It's not overt insult, not explicit discrimination. It's the quiet sense that your worth constantly needs to be verified, as if your presence is a clerical error in the system. And the sad truth is, microaggressions don't just happen in faraway places. They exist on flights, in hotels, boardrooms, classrooms, even at charity galas or international conferences. One black student once shared that his professor kept calling him the wrong name, despite there being only 12 students in the class. A female doctor of African descent said that despite wearing a white coat and a name badge, she was repeatedly called nurse by patients and new colleagues alike. We don't always remember every apology, but we remember very clearly each time someone questioned, "Are you sure is this really your place?" And the strange thing is, those who commit microaggressions often don't believe they're doing anything wrong. They think they're just double-checking. They think they're following protocol. But to the one being targeted, each unnecessary check feels like a whispered message, I don't think you belong here. And over time, those whispers become an echo lodged deep in the heart. Anaya understood this. She didn't lash out. She didn't argue. She simply closed her book, reminded herself to take a deep breath, and like many times before, she chose to respond with inner strength rather than confrontation. The small lesson from microaggressions doesn't lie in anger. It lies in recognizing clearly, I see this, I understand this, but I will not let it define me. But sometimes things go beyond the quiet. Because microaggressions, if left unchecked, can escalate into behavior that's no longer micro at all. Like when a hand not only checks your ticket, but rises aimed at your face, filled with misplaced arrogance and misused authority. And that was exactly what happened to Anaya. At 30,000 feet, that slap was a climax no one saw coming. No one on the plane heard a scream. No one shouted. No one pounded on the cockpit door. No one jumped up like in the movies. There was just one sound, clear, sharp, and isolated in the first-class cabin that had been quiet as a library. A slap. A sound so sudden that many hadn't even processed what had just happened. But Anaya knew. And the woman in front of her, the one who slapped her, knew too. Just seconds before Anaya had gently pressed the flight attendant call button. She simply meant to ask about the flight delay because the text alerts from the airline and the screen information didn't match. She remained calm. There was nothing disrespectful about the question. But the flight attendant didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at Anaya with irritation, then said a sentence loud enough for nearby rows to hear, "If you can't behave in this cabin, maybe you should get off the plane." Anaya didn't retort. She simply replied, "I believe I have the right to ask politely." That was all. A second later, the hand swung, and the slap came down without warning. A real slap. Not symbolic, not metaphorical. A real hand striking a real face on an airplane in a supposedly civilized society in a first-class cabin where the only sound should have been the clink of glass and polite thank yous. The man in the seat beside her stood up. Another flight attendant rushed forward from the rear. No one said anything at first because no one could believe it had really happened. No one took pictures. No one live-streamed. Because the slap didn't feel like an incident. It felt like a dark secret suddenly exposed and everyone froze in its presence. Anaya didn't cry. She simply tilted her head, placed a hand gently on her cheek, and looked directly at the woman who had slapped her. Her gaze wasn't angry, wasn't fearful. It was a silent, piercing look of unforgiveness. A gaze that forced the other to look down. Not out of scolding, but because she had been fully seen. Later, one passenger recalled on an aviation forum, "I've never felt silence so heavy." Not because no one knew what had happened, but because no one had any good excuse for what just occurred. And that's what made the slap echo louder than applause or shouting ever could. It became a symbol of how misused authority and hidden bias can burst out violently when people can no longer mask what festers inside. It forced every passenger to ask themselves if she had been white, if she'd been wearing designer clothes, if her name were Madison instead of Anaya, would this have happened? But what made that moment truly unforgettable wasn't just the slap. It was what happened right after when a voice rose from the front of the cabin. Is there a problem, Dr. Blake? That voice wasn't from a passenger, it was from the pilot. And in that moment, everything shifted. No one expected that voice to speak up at such a perfect moment. From the front of the cabin, the pilot, a salt and pepper-haired man, stepped out with a calm but serious expression. He didn't look at the flight attendant. He didn't look at the stunned passengers. He looked straight at Anaya. Is there a problem, Dr. Blake? The entire first-class cabin froze at those last three words. Dr. Blake, not miss, not ma'am, but doctor, a title that commands respect earned through education and position. Anaya gave a gentle nod, saying nothing. She didn't need to say anything, because the presence of the captain said it all. The flight attendant, the woman who had just slapped her, took a step back. She seemed as if she wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. She had no idea or never imagined that the quiet black woman sitting in seat 2A wasn't just a first-class passenger. She had chartered the entire flight for the executive board of the airline. She was a strategic shareholder. And more importantly, she had been part of the investment team that helped develop the very aircraft they were flying on. The shift in the energy of the cabin was something Anaya had seen many times, but it always left a bitter taste. When people think you're someone unworthy, they interrogate you. But when they find out you have power, they apologize profusely, offer water, a free meal. Power, when not visible, is rarely respected, and politeness, when not paired with awareness, becomes a thin veil for bias. Ironically, the very fact that Anaya didn't flaunt, didn't wear a name tag that said, "I'm the investor," made it easier for people to underestimate her. Society has grown used to associating power with flash, Rolex, watches, designer suits, personal drivers. But there is another kind of power. Quiet, elegant, unspoken. And that is real power. Some passengers began to shift uncomfortably. The man in seat 2B turned slightly toward her and stammered, I didn't realize you were. Anaya just smiled gently. That's okay. Now you do. After the incident, the airline issued a public apology. The flight attendant was suspended indefinitely, and a nationwide forum on implicit bias in the service industry was held, using this very story as its opening case. Anaya didn't give long speeches. She said only one short sentence. Power doesn't always need to be loud, and not everyone sitting in first class needs to prove anything. The lesson in that moment wasn't about revenge through titles. It was about rooted silence, a kind of silence that doesn't come from weakness, but from a deep knowledge of one's own worth, a calmness that causes all false assumptions to quietly collapse. But what we need to talk about now is not just one particular flight attendant. It's about a system where people like Anaya are constantly suspected, first respected later. And to understand why that still happens, we have to look closely at the very structure that keeps those assumptions alive. Anaya stepped off that plane the same way she stepped on, calm, composed, without a single outburst. But what echoed after that flight wasn't the slap. It was a quiet question lingering in many minds. How could someone like her own the plane? That question, even if unspoken, is the echo of a very specific type of hidden prejudice, what sociologists call elite bias. Elite bias doesn't always come with bad intentions. Sometimes it arrives as surprise or positive shock, like, "Oh, I didn't expect you to be the CEO." Or, "Wow, it's impressive that you're the founder." It sounds like a compliment. But in reality, those reactions subtly reinforce an invisible standard, that the image of an owner, a leader, a successful person does not look like you. And if you do look different, in skin tone, gender, or background, then your success will always come with a question mark. In the US, according to 2022 data, only 2.3% of all businesses are owned by Black women. And the number is even smaller when looking at medium to large enterprises, especially in sectors like finance, tech, and aviation. So when someone like Anaya Blake appears, not with a temporary title but with actual ownership, society doesn't know where to place her. It's surprised, it's confused, and sometimes it reacts with suspicion, as if her very presence must be double-checked. Elite bias doesn't just happen in aviation. It's present everywhere stratification exists. An Asian American lawyer once shared that in many court hearings, he was mistaken for the translator assistant of his own client. A black female doctor shared how patients kept insisting, "Where's the real doctor?" even as she stood beneath a plaque with her own name on it. And sadly, those misidentifications fuel a system where power is only recognized when it comes in a familiar image. But real power doesn't have to look like anyone else. It can wear a sweater instead of a suit. It can tie its hair back instead of using a salon blowout. It can board a plane quietly, but when necessary, it can change the very rules of how that plane operates. This isn't about telling successful people they should flaunt their status to be respected. On the contrary, the lesson is we must expand our definition of what success looks like. Because if only those who dress like us, speak like us, or live like us are recognized, then we are quietly excluding many people who are deeply worthy. Anaya didn't change herself to fit the standard. She let the standard change after it collided with her unwavering presence. But the bigger question is, why did she have to be hurt before she was respected? That brings us to a very important part of this story. A part no one wants to talk about, but everyone needs to understand. The silent choices of those who are often hurt. When she was slapped, Anaya didn't react the way many expected. She didn't scream. She didn't shout. She didn't stand up and demand the attendant be removed from the plane. Instead, she simply raised her hand to her cheek, looked directly at the woman who had hit her, and remained silent. That silence wasn't shock. It wasn't fear. It was the silence of someone who had seen this before, who fully understood what was happening, and who chose not to play by the offender's rules. In the Black community, especially among Black women, there is a phrase passed down through generations: be twice as good to get half as much. It means you're not allowed to react too strongly, even if you've been publicly disrespected. Because if you get angry, you're immediately labeled aggressive, unprofessional, difficult. Anaya understood that. She knew that even though she was the one assaulted, if she raised her voice, she would instantly be perceived differently. Not as a victim, but as a problem passenger. She understood how the system works, and she chose not to hand over the power to define her to anyone else. Many people later asked her, "Why didn't you react in the moment? Why didn't you press charges, call the media?" And she simply smiled and replied, "I don't need to shout for someone to hear me. I just need them to know I saw them." And I remember, her silence wasn't submission. It was a declaration of presence. In history, there are many who have chosen silence, but not out of weakness. Rosa Parks, when she refused to give up her seat, didn't scream. She just sat still. And that quiet act shook the very foundation of racial segregation in America. Michelle Obama, when attacked over her clothing or skin tone during her husband's presidency, never lashed back publicly. Instead, she let her speeches, her actions, and her integrity speak for her. Anaya was no different. She knew that her voice didn't need to be sound. It could be her gaze, her posture, her exit from the cabin with the same composure she carried when she entered. This isn't to say that silence is always the answer. There are moments when we must speak up, defend ourselves, demand justice. But in certain situations, like on an airplane, a confined space where power dynamics are sharply defined, the wisest response is not shouting, but letting others face the weight of their actions in the light of your unshaken dignity. Anaya understood that when you control your response, you control the entire game. Still, if her story had ended in silence, it may have faded into the background. But it didn't. That flight and that slap sparked broader conversations. Was this just an isolated incident, or was it a clear sign that a long-standing system had been operating off course? And to find the answer, we must examine the very foundations that made this kind of discriminatory behavior seem normal. Some tried to frame what happened to Anaya as a misunderstanding. Others called it a lapse in judgment, one attendant losing control in a moment of stress. But Anaya, and many others who have experienced similar moments, knew the truth. This wasn't an accident. It was a symptom of something much bigger, more persistent, and far more invisible. A system in which people like her must always prove their worth before being trusted, before being respected even, before being properly served. Let's zoom out beyond that single flight. In the past 5 years, major U.S. airlines have faced repeated reports of systemic, discriminatory behavior. In 2021, a group of black passengers was asked to leave a plane simply for talking too loudly, though they broke no rules. In 2019, a Middle Eastern woman was denied boarding because a flight attendant claimed she was acting strangely. In reality, she had only been whispering a prayer in her native language. A black pilot shared that he was repeatedly asked to show additional ID by security personnel, something that never happened to his white colleagues on the same shifts. These incidents happen far too often to be called isolated. The problem isn't a single person, it lies in assumptions. Assumptions nurtured by culture, media, and organizational routines. Assumptions that black passengers are less likely to belong in first class, that a woman of color dressed simply must be in the wrong seat, that anyone who doesn't look like a VIP needs to be double-checked. These assumptions aren't written in training manuals, but they're transmitted through glances, tone of voice, unconscious reflexes, and eventually they become part of the system. And the most dangerous thing about that system is this: it functions without orders. No one has to say, "Don't trust this person." Just enough suspicious glances, repeated ticket checks, and cold apologies after offense. And the message is sent: you don't belong here. Anaya understood her experience wasn't rare. The only difference was on that particular flight, in that particular moment, the story was exposed so clearly that no one could look away. And that was when people started asking a much bigger question. If this could happen to her, someone successful, composed, established, what is happening to those without the strength to protect themselves? We can't repair a system if we keep labeling its symptoms as isolated incidents. For real change to happen, we must be willing to look directly into the hidden operating structures, the ones silently reproducing bias, even when no one gives the order. Anaya didn't demand anyone be fired. She simply requested three things: transparency, retraining, and most importantly, a sincere apology from the system, not just from an individual. And from her story, a small movement began to spread. Airlines began organizing more training programs on implicit bias, encouraging passengers to report even the smallest signs of discriminatory behavior. But here's something that needs to be said clearly. Systemic change takes time. And for change to last, we need more than outrage. We need people who are willing to stand up, and also those who know how to stand still without stepping back. And that is exactly what Anaya did. She didn't slam the table. She didn't call for boycotts. She simply entered the space was underestimated, was struck, and then transformed that moment into a turning point for the entire industry. She didn't choose confrontation, but she never surrendered. And what happens when a woman like her not only survives prejudice, but forces the system to listen? After the incident went public, the debate didn't center solely on the slap. It shifted toward how Anaya chose to respond. Some observers, angry on her behalf, demanded that the airline fire the attendant, immediately release security footage, and offer a public financial settlement. They wanted a clear punishment, a strong deterrent. To them, justice meant retribution. But Anaya didn't choose that path. She didn't sue. She didn't speak to the press at length. She declined talk show invitations. Instead, she requested a closed-door meeting with the airline's executive leadership and presented three proposals. 1. Mandatory unconscious bias training for all flight crew industry-wide. 2. A dedicated reporting line independent of the chain of command for passengers to report discriminatory treatment. 3. A public apology, not for her alone, but for everyone who had been treated like her, yet had no voice to speak up. When asked why she chose that route, she responded gently, "I don't need to destroy anyone to affirm my worth. I just want to rebuild a way of operating where I, and those like me, can walk in without needing to prove anything." Perhaps that's what made Anaya's story so powerful. She had every right to reclaim her dignity through punishment, but instead she restored her dignity through influence. She didn't make anyone pay. She simply made everyone answer a deeper question: how can we change so this never happens again? To anyone. Her way of handling the situation reminded many of other figures, people who had been harmed but chose to build rather than destroy. Like Christian Cooper, who was falsely reported to the police by a white woman in Central Park simply for asking her to leash her dog as the law required. He could have pressed charges and had public support, but he declined to prosecute and instead became the face of awareness campaigns against racial profiling in public spaces. Or Nelson Mandela, who after nearly 30 years of imprisonment chose not to seek revenge, but initiated a national reconciliation process that led South Africa away from hatred without further bloodshed. People like this, including Anaya, remind us justice isn't only about taking someone to court. Justice is also about rebuilding the invisible structures that made the injustice possible in the first place. Justice is when the one who has been harmed is not only restored, but becomes someone who can protect others from similar harm. Forgiveness doesn't erase accountability, but it gives accountability a chance to be carried out more humanely. Anaya didn't forget the slap, but she refused to let it become the centerpiece of the story. She transformed it into a starting point for dialogue, for policy change, and for awakening within the airline industry. And perhaps the most beautiful thing is this. After it all, she continued to sit in her rightful seat, on planes and boardrooms among the same stares that once doubted her presence. She didn't need a red carpet. She didn't need an escort. She didn't need a platinum VIP badge. All she had was her e-ticket and the quiet confidence of someone who knew she belonged. First class was designed as a space for luxury, for quiet, for the well-off. But for decades, the image most people pictured in that seat didn't look like Anaya, and her presence alone changed that image. She didn't give a speech. She didn't stage a protest. She just sat there. Because sometimes representation doesn't need words. It just needs to exist. There's a famous saying, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. Anaya didn't bring a chair. She built the table. She didn't wait for an invitation. She placed herself where people like her should have been all along. And that simple, unceremonious act redefined the space around her. Representation isn't just a hashtag. It's not about adding diverse faces to ads or social media feeds. Representation is when a child sees someone who looks like them in a role that's never been theirs before. Representation is when a black girl boards a flight, sees Anaya in seat 2A, and thinks, maybe I can be there too. And from that moment, possibility expands. No longer a faraway dream, but a viable scenario. At a conference following the incident, when asked, how does it feel to become a symbol? Anaya quietly answered, I don't want to be a symbol. I just want the girls after me, not to have to be the exception. That answer hushed the entire room because it touched the deepest truth, the normalization of presence. Not everyone wants to be an icon. Many people just want to do their work, live with integrity, and be treated with the respect they deserve. But in an unbalanced world, simple existence can become an act of transformation. This isn't about needing to sit in first class to be respected. It's about this: we need a world where every seat can belong to anyone if they've earned it. Anaya's presence changed that first-class cabin, not in terms of seating, but in terms of perception. And sometimes it's not how loudly you speak, but how calmly you sit that shakes long-standing structures the most. Still, this story isn't just about a seat. It's about how one person responds to injustice, not with reactivity, but with vision. It's about using your own experience to open a path for those who never imagined they could walk through the door. And when one woman dares to do that, when she uses a painful moment to plant seeds of change, what she leaves behind isn't just inspiration, it's action. Something interesting happened after the dust settled. Not everyone remembered the slap. Not everyone could quote the exact words exchanged on that flight. But almost everyone remembered one image: the black woman sitting silently in seat 2A, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze steady and unapologetic. She didn't lower her head. She didn't shout. She just sat there with a composure that made the entire room adjust its own volume. That is what Anaya left behind. The quiet strength of someone who knows her worth and doesn't need to prove it. In a world where people are quick to rage, quick to post, quick to explode, the choice to maintain dignity in silence is no easy feat, but it is one of the most powerful. You may never be slapped on an airplane, But maybe you've been overlooked in a meeting because you speak softly, misnamed even after correcting someone multiple times, interrupted mid-sentence only to hear your idea repeated by someone else who gets the credit. Those moments may seem small, but they are quiet cuts to the self-worth we carry inside. And each time you're faced with a choice, do you lash out, walk away, or remain still so your presence itself forces reflection? Anaya chose the third. She didn't flip the table. She simply sat down. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was a form of resistance that left no one bruised, but made the entire room rethink its behavior. Because sometimes dignity isn't about what you say, it's about staying exactly as you are, even when the world around you tries to shake you. Anaya Blake's story isn't a tabloid headline. It's a gentle but mighty reminder to us all. You don't have to scream to be powerful. You just have to stay still long enough for the world to realize it was wrong to shake you. And if you, like Anaya, have ever walked into a room where others thought you didn't belong, if you've been judged, questioned, or doubted, remember this: you don't need to raise your voice. You just need to keep walking in with your head high, your spirit steady, and your kindness intact. Because the way you show up, the way you sit without asking for permission, the way you refuse to shrink under prejudice, that alone may be what changes the room from the inside out. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If you saw yourself in Anaya's story, leave a comment. Share this story not to judge the past, but to help shape the future. Because who knows, you might be the next person to walk into a room and make it go quiet just by being there. See you in the next story, where even the smallest act can shift what once seemed unshakable.